Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Singing Brain. Today, we are very lucky to have with us Dominique Vuvan. She has just received her PhD in psychology with a certificate from the program in neuroscience from the University of Toronto in 2012. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the International Laboratory of Brain, Music, and Sound Research, otherwise known as BRAMS, from 2012 to 2016. Currently, she is an assistant professor in psychology in the psychology department in neuroscience program at Skidmore College. Professor Vuvan is the director of the Skidmore Music and Cognition Laboratory, also known as MaCLab, which focuses on the neurocognition of music with particular interests in expectancy processing, language-music interaction, and individual differences. That is, those are quite the accomplishments you have. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Good, I'm glad. So this is obviously a pretty niche field. How did you come across this and eventually become so accomplished within it?
So I think actually it's becoming less niche all the time. The fact that you're doing the series at all shows that people are super interested in the questions that music cognition has to offer. But definitely when I got started back in the mid 2000s, it was very, very niche. I was just very lucky that I was an undergrad at University of Toronto at the time, and there were just a ton of people in the psychology and neuroscience departments who were interested in questions about music. So I grew up playing music. I started classical piano lessons when I was very young, and I did that all through my adolescence. And then when I got to middle school, I started playing in bands. I was like in jazz bands, and I started playing in rock bands and stuff. And so throughout my life, I was really interested in music. When I got to college, I had to make some decisions about what I wanted to study. And I decided not to study music. And so I was looking for a way to continue sort of having music as part of my life. And so when I got to the point in my undergrad, when I was looking for research opportunities to sort of join labs and stuff, I was extremely thrilled to find that there were multiple faculty at the University of Toronto who were doing research that had to do with music and the brain and psychology. So that's how I got started. I joined a lab in my undergrad, and then after that, I went on to do grad school, and then you sort of read off the rest of the things that I've done since then.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely the common thread that we find. People started out, interested in performing, and they didn't want to have to pick and choose what they ended up studying. And so they found that they could study both. That's great. I'm glad to hear that you came across the field and we're able to talk to you today. So something that one of your research focuses is music and language. So what are the similarities that you find between those two topics?
So music and language, I think, are in some ways, sort of a natural, sort of intuitive pair. Like, I think there's a lot of things that people will instantly grasp are sort of similar between them. A lot of folks like to talk about music, like calling it a language. I don't necessarily object to that language, but I think we don't know enough to be able to equate them. But there are certainly similarities in between. So you can look at the surface of music and language, right, and notice that both of them use sound. In both music and language, sort of vocal production is really, really important. For me in particular, because I care about prediction, the fact that both music and language unfold over time is really, really important, meaning that you're always, when you're processing these things, waiting and making predictions about what's going to come next. And then more recently, people have started doing research into notation. So looking at sort of like written translations of what is sort of starts out typically as an oral kind of domain, and showing sort of like interesting similarities and also differences between the way that we might read language and read musical notation. Yeah. There's also underlying things, right? So things that you don't see directly when you look at the surface of what music and language look like. You can think about the ways that they both influence your emotions. You can think about the ways that they might be similar in terms of their syntax, which is the technical term that we use to describe sort of the structure of language and music. So we're talking about like, how do we combine sounds into syllables, into words, into sentences, into phrases, and so on. For music, syntax looks like thinking about notes and rhythms and combining those into phrases and combining those into sort of longer melodies and songs and that kind of stuff. I already mentioned prediction, right? So because you have this sort of unfolding over time, both of them require a large amount of prediction when it comes to thinking about how we process them. And then we might also ask questions about the semantics or the meaning of music and language, which are interesting questions to try to figure out, like, what does meaning mean for music versus language, and how might those be the same?
That's a really cool similarity I hadn't thought about. I guess the human brain tends to like to fill in the blank, and that is definitely a interesting similarity between music and language. I feel like everyone tries to either sing the next lyric or figure out, sort of jump ahead and figure out what somebody's going to say. So I like that.
Yeah, totally.
Another one of your interests, your main interests, are music and cognition. Can you explain the intersection between those two as well?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons that music cognition as a field is growing is because people are coming to recognize what a fantastic laboratory music is actually for understanding cognition. So really briefly, we can think about cognition as defined as, like, how does your brain or your mind process information, right? So we can use this kind of information processing metaphor. So if you want to know how your thinking works, you need to use a material or a domain to study thinking sort of in its natural habitat. And you want that domain to be suitably complex so that it sort of captures the complexity of our cognition, right? The way that we sort of process very complex things in the world. And on top of that, you also want something that conflicts, which is that you want to, as a scientist in the lab, be able to use materials that are really controllable, right? You want to be able to know exactly what the sort of moving parts and the constituents of the laboratory materials that you use are. So music is amazing for this because you can basically bring someone into the lab and you can have them listen to something like a musical excerpt that is very similar to their experience of listening to that thing outside of the lab. Right. So it's not particularly artificial to have someone put on some headphones and sort of listen to a snippet of music, even though they're in the lab, and it might be like, obviously they're not chilling out in their room or whatever, but it's still like quite realistic. This makes music experiments somewhat different from other kinds of perceptual experiments where you come in and you're looking at a screen and you're like, look at this flashing cross. And then when the red light comes on, you push a button, right? That's a very artificial kind of task. Like, you aren't out there in the world looking at flashing crosses, waiting for a particular color to show up in the middle of the screen or whatever. With music listening tasks, we can often sort of capture everyday real life experience, which is awesome. And you also get that other piece, which is that you can control it, right? We know a lot through the work of musicologists and music theorists about what the building blocks of music are. You know, sort of what notes you should use if you want to stay in key, you know what rhythms to use if you want to have people sort of locked into a particular beat. And so knowing all of those little details helps you be able to, as a scientist, sort of control stuff in the lab, which is super great.
That's really cool. So music is sort of a natural way to study cognition instead of using that like sort of high pressurized scenario where you're in a lab, you're in a lab and you're doing these things that wouldn't be just like menial tasks during the day.
Totally. I'll put in a disclaimer here because this is not to put past music psychologists using beeps and boops and like button pressing tasks and that kind of stuff. We still do that.
Right.
But I think there is kind of this
importance too.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's an important distinction. So you talked about, before about the connection between music and language. Do you think there's any benefit that music can have in regards to reading comprehension for specifically younger kids?
I think this is a very, very complex question to ask because there are so many determinants of someone's musical experience and their musical performance, as well as so many complex determinants of performance on a reading comprehension task.
Sure.
So my answer is definitely maybe.
Yes.
I think the research community is still out there trying to figure out these connections, right? Because what that really comes down to is questions about are music and language kind of the same thing? Meaning that, like, if you're good at one thing, are you also going to be good at the other thing?
Yeah.
Or secondarily, if they're not the same thing, are they similar enough that you can observe what we call transfer, right? Mm-hmm. So transfer between your skills in one domain and another domain.
Yeah.
When we talk about transfer, we have the term near transfer and far transfer. So near transfer talks about like things that are very, very, very close together. So you can imagine, for instance, that if you were to practice pressing a button every time you heard a boop in the lab and not when you heard a beep, and then you were then tested with a different task where you had to press a button when you heard a bip and not a blap, right? That's very near transfer. So you're like, you practice one thing and you get really good at it, and then you do a task that is very, very, very similar, both in form and in content, And then you clearly get sort of this connection, right? Near transfer is really, really easy to show in the lab. Far transfer is more difficult. And far transfer looks like the question that you're asking me, which is like, okay, so if somebody, for instance, like plays the piano, does that make them better at reading comprehension? And so that asks all sorts of questions about like, okay, what parts of playing the piano, like what parts of that training are similar to or equivalent to the things that we're going to be asking participants to be doing when they're reading aloud or reading a book or whatever it is. And so there's lots of ways that the similarities have come out in the lab, but we still don't know exactly what those sort of causal pathways look like what exactly it is. So lots of studies showing correlations between those tasks, right? So like people who are musically trained tend to be better at some kinds of language tasks. And so the research is mixed on reading comprehension, but you do see some studies where it's like, yeah, like people who are musically trained tend to be better at this. You also see connections in the therapeutic world. So for instance, there's a very common music therapy called melodic intonation therapy, where after stroke, you have people relearn how to speak by singing, right? So they've lost their sort of ability to produce fluid sentences, but they are able to sing the sentences in a fluid way. And so you kind of like almost hijack the music system in order to connect it back, like remake these connections in terms of the language system. So we do have lots of indications that there are connections here, but we're not quite at the point where we can definitely say like, yes, definitely if you like train with music or have this particular kind of musical experience, you're definitely going to have this kind of outcome when it comes to reading comprehension.
Sure. And spoken like a true scientist, definitely.
You probably had this come up a lot before. People are like, well,
yeah, we don't want to make any, sweeping proclamations, but that's the thing about science is it's messy. There's not always clear answers. We're not at the point, and I think that's
totally
for people to see.
Yeah.
So this is my favorite question to ask all of our interviews. What is the most exciting or your favorite story or finding that you've had from your extensive research?
Yeah, I loved this question, and I had to think really hard about it because I actually wasn't sure, because there's just so many sort of interesting things that happen with research that it was hard to pick something. But I think right now, and maybe my answer would change next week, but right now what I'm thinking about is collaboration and the way that music cognition as a field is this sort of heavily interdisciplinary space where like people like me who have training, like I'm trained as a cognitive neuroscientist, right? So like I have lots of experience doing experiments in the lab with brain and behavioral kinds of like software and like that kind of stuff. But because I'm asking questions about music, I do my best work when I'm doing it in collaboration with people who have training in the other sort of like related fields, right? So I have lots of collaborations with music theorists, for instance, when sometimes I'm like, okay, I want this particular manipulation, but I actually don't know how to get that. And so I consult out and I'm like, okay, you're a music theorist. How do we do this? Like, what is the best note to play here? I'm not sure which one. This is the effect that I want, right? And that's how you can like do your best work. And so collaborations with people from other disciplines, I think, is like my favorite part of the job. Mostly because it results in so many sort of like findings that are surprising and interesting. And in particular, I find it really interesting to see that we can work on the same project and we get such different things out of it, both super important, but not at all the same thing. So like, I'll give you an example of this. Recently, my lab has been working on trying to understand the way that people process musical structure when it comes to popular music forms. So in the past, most research in this area is really focused on sort of what we call common practice music, which is like what you think of when you think classical music, right? So like Mozart, Bach, like that kind of stuff. But like, that's not actually what most people listen to on a daily basis, not even in Western Europe, right, where that music was born, do people spend most of their time listening to that genre, which means that as cognitive scientists, if we think about the ways that our experience shapes our cognition, we're not really testing the right thing. We should probably be testing more popular forms, things that people are actually listening to, right? Rock music, pop music, hip hop, whatever it is that your population of interest is listening to. So we've done a bunch of this work. And like, for me, when I do this work, I'm like, as a cognitive scientist, I'm thinking about things like cognitive flexibility, right? Do people listen differently if they're listening to jazz music versus hip hop, for instance? Like, do they have their sort of like minds working in a different way? How specific are people listening, right? So like when they listen to a hip hop track versus a classical piece, like do the structures that they use to understand what they're hearing change, or do they use like one general structure? So I'm like really interested in what's happening in terms of processing. My friend Bryn Hughes, who's the music theorist that I collaborate with a lot on this, he's a pop music theorist, and he's always trying to figure out like, how does rock music work, right? Or like, how does hip hop work? And so his questions, when we do the exact same experiment, have nothing to do with the processing. He's trying to like use the processing to understand like, how is rock music substantially or not substantially different from classical music, right? And so he's really interested in saying, being able to say things like, oh, rock music and popular forms are much more permissive forms. They allow for a lot more sort of fuzzy borders and that kind of thing when it comes to pitch and rhythm, as compared to sort of this like common practice stuff. And I find that really thrilling to have a conversation with somebody who you work with so closely on the exact same project and just be thinking in completely different universes about what that means, which is just so exciting and fun.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how amazing that you both can work on the same exact experiment and just be working in totally different worlds of thought. I think that's really fascinating as well.
Yeah, totally.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Vuvan, for joining us. I appreciate your time and for explaining your very impressive research.
Cool. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Awesome.